Is it 48 families or is it 463 families? Because that's a big fucking difference.
Now you're guilty until proven innocent. It should be innocent until proven guilty, but I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic, and we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Stephanie, so I know that you are totally obsessed with the Maui situation. So I want to start off today with this story. And you're on TikTok more than I am, so I'm assuming that you've probably seen this, but I came across an article on HITC that there was another article published in this periodical or something called Real Raw News last week, or I guess it's a website, but it was talking about how Navy SEALs found 15 missing Maui children, and they were imprisoned in these padlock cages that had like pee pads in them. And this was all at some warehouse near Pier 51 in Honolulu Harbor. Like, did you hear about this?
Yeah, I did see this going around on TikTok. I don't know what to think because a few weeks ago, there was another article by this Real Raw News. And that article was talking about how these Marines had like gotten into a shootout or something with FEMA because they found out that FEMA was like burying the bodies they were finding to try to like cover up how many bodies there were and like the evidence and what took place. And that was right around like right after that was when they put up that barrier wall that we talked about on a previous episode. But when I was trying to find other articles or just anything on it, like all these other news outlets were debunking the story, saying it was fake. And I mean, I clearly don't trust the mainstream media. So like, that's where I don't really know what to believe because it could be true. And quite frankly, nothing would surprise me at this point. But unfortunately with Maui, I just feel like I don't know that we're ever going to get the whole truth. And even if it were true, do you really think the mainstream media would be allowed to report it?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I guess this article was like super detailed, and it was talking about how like a Navy sniper shot at a guard and it struck him in the neck. And then a Navy SEAL commander punched a guy in the kidney and subdued him with like one punch. And then they got inside, and there were 8 boys and 7 girls, and they were covered in their own urine and feces and locked in these dog cages and doped up on sedatives. And it does seem very far-fetched. And so the article I was reading was totally debunking it. And they were saying that Real Raw News is a parody and satire website, and that they say that on their website. And since they're the only ones that publish the information, like it's very unlikely. And also, like Navy SEALs would never reveal the details of their mission. And that just sounds like an action movie, right? But the article also pointed out that USA Today recently debunked the report of the 1,000 children missing. And I guess there was an FBI list that was released on September 9th that listed all of the people that were unaccounted for, and only one person was labeled as a minor. And so while I'm assuming the story about kids locked in cages might be fake, I am questioning the 1,000 missing children part.
Well, I know that like the missing children were reported by, it was either the school board or the school district, because I watched the press conference on it where they were talking about like how many children had re-enrolled versus the children they couldn't track down. And obviously like mainstream media just didn't want to report it. They were doing a terrible job of reporting it. And that's where I think I played the clip, or maybe we talked about it. And that one reporter started yelling at the governor, and he's like, "Where are the missing children?" And like the governor wouldn't answer him. And then he like banned him. But that was way back when they were still trying to track people down, and they didn't know like if these people went to the mainland or if they went to private schools. And it was very like all up in the air, and they weren't really sure about that part. But like with the whole thing with missing kids and like the kids in these cages and stuff like that, what's really crazy to think about is that this stuff really does happen. Like we know that child trafficking is a huge problem right here in the US and all over the world. So as crazy as it sounds, we know it happens. So it's
Right.
like, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and the numbers seem like they're not adding up, right? So I looked up this USA Today article and it came out last week and it was quoting what officials were saying, and they said that hundreds of students haven't enrolled in Maui public schools following the fires, but according to officials that doesn't mean they're missing. Only 66 people are confirmed to be missing, one of whom is a minor. And the article went on to talk about how students haven't enrolled in school because, according to the Hawaii Department of Education website, one of the Lahaina schools was damaged beyond repair by the fire. And then there are 3 other schools that are still undergoing environmental assessments and like tests for stable power and broadband connectivity. And so a spokesperson for the Department of Education told USA Today, quote, of the 3,000 students who had originally enrolled in the 4 schools before the fire, 782 students enrolled in other Department of Education schools, 907 enrolled or are on the wait list for distance learning, and 330 enrolled in charter or private schools. About 980 students have not transferred elsewhere or applied for distance learning. And this article also stated that the school board has not been able to reach 48 families of kids who were previously enrolled in the school. But then apparently the governor's office and the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency Maui Joint Information Center both stated the same thing as the FBI report. And they said there are only 66 people unaccounted for. But they also stated, quote, we are not releasing which ones are children, but they are a variety of ages. And then the spokesperson for the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency further added that 2,025 students who have not enrolled in another public school or opted for distance learning have, quote, nothing to do with the actual number of confirmed missing, which still stands at 66. But then I read another article on factcheck.org, who's always trying to debunk things. And that came out on Wednesday. And they were saying there was a nonprofit news site called The 74 that covers education. And they reported on September 11th that the Department of Education in Hawaii has not heard back from 463 families that it tried to contact. And this fact check article wasn't contesting that. And they said, quote, but the department could not release the number of students who died or remain missing because the numbers are so small that we'd be in effect identifying them, and that would violate the privacy of families. So here's my question. Is it 48 families or is it 463 families? Because that's a big fucking difference. And both of those numbers are coming from official departments in Hawaii, either the Department of Education or the Emergency Management Agency. And then there's 2,025 students not enrolled, as the emergency management spokesperson said, or is it 980, as the Department of Education spokesperson said? Because that's also another big fucking difference. And it's like, there's a lot of inconsistencies here and no actual answers.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I was thinking about this the other day and about how, like, you know, we're not hearing anything about these missing kids and people still aren't being allowed to access parts of the area. And so the conspiracy theorist in me started, you know, going. And I thought, oh my God, what if there are all these missing kids and they're like being held hostage in some way because they're being used as a bargaining tool, like to keep the parents from fighting back or speaking out or whatever. And like, I don't know, maybe this seems far-fetched, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm willing to believe anything at this point because it's just like the craziest stuff that we've heard that like has been true. It's just, you don't really know. Like, I don't want to discount anything. One thing I thought of when you were talking about the like just the discrepancy of like who's missing was there was a girl on TikTok who like lives somewhere on the mainland in like United States, and her brother lived in Maui and she couldn't get a hold of him and tried calling everyone, hospitals, the police, the government, got nowhere. So she finally flies to Maui to like get in front of people. And still, like after being there for days and days and days, she's like, it was pointless for me to come here. No one's helping me. There are no answers. I will never know. I'm never going to have like evidence that, yes, he did perish in the fire. Likely he did, but I'm never going to like know for sure or get that confirmation that I was looking for. And so it's like, how many people are there like that where their family lives on the mainland and is like trying to contact the government and the government's not helping or reporting it or answering? And I don't know, it's just really bad. But like, again, there's so many conspiracy theories around it. And there's like this one that does involve kids that's going around TikTok. Okay. So take it with a grain of salt, obviously. It's not like this is being reported anywhere, but they were talking about how there are tunnels under Maui. Like there's video footage of this. And so the theory is that all of these people, these locals, are saying that they had spotted a cargo ship near Lahaina, like right before the fire. So the conspiracy theory goes that like the kids were called off school, which we know is true. The school was canceled. So while the kids were home and the parents were at work, these kids were like taken into this tunnel system, then out to this cargo ship. And then the fires were started right after. So it was like a distraction, but also a reason for like why all these kids would not be turning up anywhere. Which again, like I think it's all far-fetched. And I think it really deters from the very likely motive, which is that they were clearing out the land that the natives were never going to sell to make room for this smart city. But it is weird that like these numbers aren't matching up. But at the same time, if there were all these missing kids, where are the families and the parent? Like, did the whole family perish together? Or like, there's got to be someone that was not right there in Lahaina where the fire was that would be like, where's my grandson or niece or nephew? And we're just not hearing that, like not on social media or on the news. So like that's a kind of puts things into question too. Like, where are the friends, the relatives, the school friends, the teachers? And like, why wouldn't they be speaking out on like why they can't get a hold of these people, all these missing kids? So it's just really weird. And again, like I don't think the mainstream media would report on it, even if this all were true and there was evidence and everything. I don't think they would report on it. And so far, like they've pretty much called everything a conspiracy theory. And there's one news network that I'm on the fence with because like they don't seem to be pushing propaganda like the other news networks, and that's Newsmax. So I'm going to play a clip from a Newsmax reporter that is just putting it all out there and like tying up all the conspiracy theories into like a nice little package and kind of saying like, why aren't other news outlets reporting on this? So here's the clip.
The media's lack of interest in the whole Maui story. I've been in this business for 30 years. I'm stunned, but I'm not surprised. The dots are connecting. And coincidence seems to be the story here, right? But the true story, the media knows it is not allowed to tell. But I can. Is it a coincidence that the Maui police chief is the same man who was in charge in Las Vegas during that massacre that killed 58 people? Is it a coincidence that the Maui property, owned by million and billionaires, it wasn't touched by the flames while homes of the locals all burned? Was it a coincidence that the flames traveled across hundreds of feet of pavement and crossed a 4-lane highway with emergency shoulders to jump into the ocean and then burn all the boats? Was it a coincidence that the largest system of outdoor emergency sirens in the world never made a sound as the fire devoured Lahaina? Was it a coincidence that at the same time, very same time, all the water was turned off? Was it a coincidence that police were ordered to block off streets and to funnel all the cars trying to escape onto one road where that firestorm incinerated entire families? How about the coincidence that the governor of Hawaii, Josh Green, just weeks before that inferno, signed a pledge to the UN's 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, pledging to eliminate emissions? Weird. And think about this coincidence. That governor also signed an emergency proclamation on July 17th, 3 weeks before the fire, about housing of all things, and suspended 7 state statutes protecting historic preservation laws, removing all of the red tape when it comes to building infrastructure. Coincidentally, that emergency proclamation also suspends previous building laws and gives the governor some magic wand power to appoint a housing czar to rule on the island's redevelopment. Is it a coincidence that the government put up a black fence around Lahaina, or that the FAA grounded all drones from flying over the affected areas? Is it a coincidence that since at least 2011, there have been plans to make Maui the first smart city run by 100% renewable energy, and that coincidentally, 2 of the 3 largest landowners on Maui are BlackRock and the U.S. government, and that both are part of the UN's agenda? It must be a coincidence, then, that the locals whose homes did not burn are now being evicted from their property. And, of course, a total coincidence that all the fact checkers who are checking these facts, who say everything I just told you is just a coincidence, are also owned and run by BlackRock.
Newsmax is a fairly legit news source. So that's interesting.
Yeah, they seem to be. And it was kind of like surprising that she was putting all these conspiracy theories out there. So, it just like, I think it added credibility to all of these things that make sense, but are being labeled a conspiracy theory. And she's kind of calling out like the other media sources for like, hey, why aren't you talking about this? Why aren't we allowed to like at least have a discussion about these very obvious things?
Yeah.
That are all coincidences,
Because they're not allowed to talk about anything.
Yeah.
Well, in other news, as usual, there is not a day that goes by that Biden does not embarrass our country and make an ass of himself in front of other world leaders. And so this past week, I guess there's been all these UN meetings. And on Wednesday, he was meeting with the Israeli prime minister, who is a Jewish leader. And I guess during the meeting, Biden made the sign of the Catholic cross, like that, touching his forehead and like stomach and left and right sides of his chest while the prime minister was talking. And then I think this was all taking place in New York. And then he met with Brazilian President Lula to talk about like improving labor workers' rights. And it was like the quintessential Biden senile clown show. Like first he walked or really shuffled across the stage into a fucking flagpole that was holding this like 7-foot Brazilian flag. And then he made his typical incoherent, rambling speech of garbled nonsense that you really couldn't understand what he was saying, except for the phrase, "Let me be clear," which he never is. And then he said, "No, I really mean it," which we know is his signature line when he's lying. He couldn't figure out how to use his earpiece when Lula was speaking and he was trying to get the Brazilian translation. And at one point he drops his earpiece and then he looks confused. And Lula kept having to ask like, "Mr. President, can you hear me? Can you hear me?" And then at the end of the meeting, he again was totally confused about whether to salute the audience or give them a thumbs up sign. And as I read this article in the Daily Mail, and their description was great because they said, quote, "International Labor Organization Director General Gilbert Hungbo took to the podium after the 2 world leaders, and Biden stooped to slowly grab a folder from the ground. Hungbo shook hands with Biden and Lula in turn at the close of his speech, but Biden appeared to leave Lula hanging, awkwardly saluting the audience before shuffling off stage. He appeared to be torn between giving a thumbs up or a salute and made a sloppy gesture combining the two. As Biden turned his back on the Brazilian president, Lula looked annoyed and made a sweeping gesture with his arm. When I watched it, he was gesturing towards the exit. And then they departed awkwardly from opposite sides." And I mean, this shit is humorous to talk about, but realistically, like, this is fucking embarrassing. And at this point, we could do like a 6-hour podcast just talking about Biden's public dementia moments that are being witnessed on the world stage. And it's not just Biden. Like, Congress and the federal government is riddled with geriatric people who are making important decisions. Like, there's the 90-year-old mummy, Dianne Feinstein, who, is she alive or dead? I mean, I don't know, but she's still in Congress. Then there's, glitch in the matrix, Mitch McConnell, who's frozen in public twice now. And like, it doesn't matter if it's on the Republican side or the Democrat side. Like, this shit is not okay.
No, it's not okay. And like, not only is it embarrassing, but it's the complete opposite of what people voted for. Like, the people who did vote for Biden, they were promised that he would be this great uniter and like the country would just go back to normal after this crazy pandemic and like all the rioting and like Trump drama. And what they got was someone who would not only further divide us, and actually go after political opponents, by the way, and conservative citizens, but also someone who's like angry all the time. Like, did you notice that? Like, not only does he do these stupid blunders, but he gets like angry and he'll like yell at the audience or yell at reporters or do that like creepy whisper that's like, it seems like he's angry. I don't know. It's just weird. And um they portrayed him as this, like likable grandfather figure. That's just this like sweet guy, this nice old wise guy. And like he's none of that. None of that. So like I just feel like we were all sold a lie. And even the people that were his biggest supporters have to know by now, like he cannot run again. There's just no way this can continue.
Yeah, but like here's the thing with Biden. He's an evil person, right? I mean, if you look back at his entire career, he is an evil person. But now you throw dementia into the mix. And this is what people with dementia do. They get angry and they yell. I mean, I watched my grandmother go through it, and it was very disturbing to see because that was not the woman that she was. But I mean, at one point she lost her shit in her, whatever you call it, the not retirement home, assisted living. She was in assisted living. And at one point, like she got in a fight with like 3 or 4 of the nurses that were working there because that's what happens when you get dementia. So his yelling is like totally in line with symptoms of dementia.
Right. But the problem is like both the Democrats and the Republicans are just going along with it because the only other thing would be Kamala. And like that's even worse. And so it's like we're in this horrible situation that there's really no good way to get out of.
No. And according to a report in Newsweek, our current Congress, which is the 118th Congress, the makeup of our current Congress is older than any Congress in American history. The average Democratic senator age is 65, and the average age of Republican senators is 63. And apparently, the Pentagon funded this study earlier this year that highlighted how the mental degeneration of government officials could pose a risk to national and global security because the way they reasoned it, like people are living longer and they're working later in life. Like, no shit, right? And so this article just came out in the Blaze a few days ago that was referencing this study. And the study was published by the Rand Corporation's National Security Research Division. And according to the study, quote, personnel who hold or have held security clearances have or will have dementia. Because according to the Mayo Clinic, the risk factor for dementia increases dramatically after the age of 65. So this RAM report analyzed the federal workforce, and they found that 45% of federal employees are over 50 years old. And in this report, it stated, quote, whereas with some sufferers, the pain of mental deterioration may be localized, a demented person in the national security workforce could wreak havoc on the global stage should they misplace or volunteer sensitive information. The risk that an individual becomes a national security threat because of dementia symptoms depends on many factors, such as the nature of the classified information they hold, for how long the unauthorized disclosure of that information could damage, including serious or exceptionally grave damage, and whether the individual is targeted by an adversary. And like, as we have all witnessed and we've talked about frequently on this podcast, and basically what you'll hear from any news source that isn't controlled by the left, like Biden is clearly demented. And the author of this Blaze article wrote, quote, Biden routinely exhibits signs of cognitive breakdown, tripping over nothing, mistaking his sister for his wife, repeatedly confusing the names of disparate nations, and relying on cue cards for instructions on how to execute basic functions. And that's absolutely correct. And I am not against people continuing to work over the age of 65. But they should not be in positions where they're making decisions that impact our country and impact our national security. Like, there are retirement age requirements for police, for firefighters, for pilots, for like a ton of federal positions. And at the very least, members of Congress and the federal government should be required to take a cognitive function test to prove their competency. Like, don't you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. We need cognitive tests. And I don't even think it's just for older people. I think anyone who, especially, is going to have access to sensitive information should have to go through this. Like, just look at Fetterman, the Pennsylvania senator that can't even speak a coherent sentence. Like, why
Or
hasn't he been through a cognitive test?
did you see that they changed the dress code for Senate members because of him?
No. Are you
Yeah.
serious?
So the Senate, like their dress code is always required a jacket and tie, but you know how Fetterman shows up and he's always in like shorts and a hoodie? So they changed the dress code earlier this week, and it's basically to accommodate Fetterman.
That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous and it's embarrassing and it just shows a complete lack of respect. Like you don't want someone from another country who's often in DC
Mhm.
to see our government looking like a slob. Like
Yeah.
what the hell is happening here? And while they're at it, like I definitely think they need term limits. And it's just crazy because I've never met someone that doesn't agree with that. Left or right, everyone seems to agree with term limits, but it's never going to happen because they would have to vote on term limits for themselves, and no one wants to do that. And it's like these lifelong positions create the perfect circumstances for corruption. Like if you know that you're going to be in and out in 4 years, you're not going to engage in corruption. You won't even have time to engage in corruption. Like knowing, your predecessors would find out, and it just would really limit all of these things that are going on. And when you look at like the most corrupt people, who are they? They're the people like Biden and Pelosi that are near retirement and they want to set themselves and their families up for life. So they do some really freaking corrupt shit. Anyhow, there is something else that I thought it was fake news until I looked. And I mean, it is absolutely real. Like there's articles on it, there's video of it. And it has to do with another corrupt government, which is Mexico. And they had their independence parade where the Russian and Chinese militaries participated in the parade.
Mhm.
It was unbelievable to watch this. It's like we have a wide open border and you have all these men coming over that are from not even from Mexico or South America. They're from all over the world that are coming into our country that are not properly vetted. And now we have these like military troops in Mexico marching alongside the Mexican troops from Russia and China. Like, Tara, what the fuck is going on?
Well, apparently this is like not unusual. The president of Mexico was defending it, and he's saying that Mexico has relations with all the countries of the world, and everyone has always been invited to participate in their parades. And historically, that has been the case. But keep in mind, like, Mexico hasn't placed any sanctions on Russia for invading Ukraine. So clearly, like, their relationship is good. So why shouldn't Russian soldiers be in their parade? Plus, everyone was upset about it, but nobody was complaining about China being in the parade. They were all focused on Russia because of the whole Ukraine situation. But Mexico is an authoritarian government that's in line with like Cuba and Argentina and all these other governments that are authoritarian, corrupt governments. So why should it be surprising that Russia and China were in their parade?
Right. It just feels like really scary to have this right on the other side of the United States, and especially just given the open border and the fact that these people have poured in and we know that China has all this land. So it just, when I saw that, I'm like, what the heck? But that, I mean, I guess if it's normal, okay, but I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. And you know what else that I don't like is what is going on in Texas. Like this just seems super shady, and I had to bring it up because obviously you live in Texas. But like, did you hear about this story where the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton was impeached?
Yeah, like I haven't followed it closely, but I did read a few articles. And from what I read, like this whole impeachment process was led by House Republicans. And then there were like 16 charges, and then they had something to do with bribery, and there was a mistress who didn't end up testifying, and he ended up being acquitted, but I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. I thought you were going to ask me like, what's going on with the border? Because I'm like, oh, that's a shit show too. Whole other
Well,
episode.
that's always a shit show. Yeah, we could do a whole episode on the border, and we probably will very soon because there's always crazy things going on there. Well, the only reason that I even like knew about this was Tucker Carlson did an interview with him. And it's really interesting. And to me, like, of course, this is hearing, his side of the story, but I think it's important because up until this point, we really haven't heard his side. And I think it paints a clear picture of the Biden administration and the extreme left becoming this like totalitarian state. Because a lot of what he said was how the Democrats really have control over the House in Texas. And he kind of like went into detail explaining that, but I'm going to attempt to play a clip from him. Hopefully it comes through where he kind of gives the rundown of what happened from his point of view. And it's very different from what's been reported everywhere else.
Just to your case really quick, how did you find out you were being impeached and what happened?
I literally had no idea. It was a committee meeting of the House Investigating Committee. I think it was 3 or 4 days before Memorial Weekend, the end of session. So they're busy trying to pass all these big bills, and they decide they're going to spend one day investigating me. Of course, they'd done secret investigation for 3 months that we didn't know about, behind closed doors with no transparency, no due process.
Which almost immediately after you're reelected to a third term,
Yes,
they begin investigating you.
Yes, but I don't know that. They started in March, is what they said, like March 1st. And they investigated secretly behind closed doors with no one knowing. Even the House Investigating Committee, not all of them knew. I know for sure that one of the Republicans had no idea until they got to that day that it was me. And he was told to vote for impeachment without knowing anything about the case and actually disagreeing with doing it. But he was told his career would be affected if he didn't vote for impeachment. So those 5 members had an investigation for one day. They did a 4-hour hearing. And within less than 48 hours from that, I was impeached on Saturday of Memorial Weekend without an opportunity to present my side, without an opportunity to have any sworn testimony, which is required by law. They are required to have witnesses sworn in under oath. No one was sworn in under oath. They didn't even have witnesses. They brought in investigators who had talked to witnesses, which is obviously hearsay and wrong. So that's how it all got done. It was done in
And this was a total shock to you.
I had no idea. They didn't come talk to me. They told me nothing about it. They didn't tell anybody.
So what happens once it was announced you're being impeached? What happens to you?
It was horrible. I was immediately suspended. So I lost my office. I couldn't do any more lawsuits against Biden or anything.
What do you mean you were suspended?
Suspended means I can't be in the office anymore. I can't direct what's going on in the office, even though I'm elected, even though they proved nothing, even though they had no testimony.
You hadn't been convicted.
Hadn't been convicted. They had presented no evidence. They had presented no witnesses, and I'm out.
But how? Okay. That's a very weird process. So you don't even know you're being investigated. The moment you find out you're being investigated and impeached, you're suspended from your job?
Yes. It's the way that I think it's constitutional. And I think it needs to be changed because they should have to prove something before the will of the voters is overridden. And that's what happened. The will of the voters. I was in 4.5 months. Now I've been out of office, suspended for almost 4 months. So half my time of my term now I've spent not being able to do what the people of Texas elected me to do.
How can you be removed from your job without being convicted of something?
It seems pretty crazy, but that's the way the law is. I know that the Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, has suggested now that be changed. They should have to prove that you did something wrong before they remove you from operating as somebody who was
elected.
You
just wake up in the morning, they're like, you think you're an elected official.
Yes.
And now you're not. You're just in limbo.
I walked out of when they did it that day, that Saturday, I had to walk out of the office and I haven't been back a day since, not a minute since. And it was.
Okay. So I don't know if you caught, because Tucker kind of like cut him off, but he's like, I couldn't go back into my office and I couldn't continue any lawsuits against Biden. So apparently there were lawsuits against Biden. And not only did this guy get impeached with no crime, no evidence, no conviction of anything, and no hearing, but he also is under a gag order. So he can't even defend himself in the court of public opinion. So as a Texas voter, Tara, you probably think like, okay, if I elected this guy, he's the one in the position, he's going to go work for you and your values and everything else. But apparently, if he's a Biden enemy, they can just oust him without any evidence or crime or any anything at all of wrongdoing. And like clearly Biden goes after his enemies. I mean, look at obviously Trump and anyone that supported him. You've got the FBI following parents into school board meetings. Were you
I
gonna say
think
something?
Paxton, yeah, I think Paxton was a big Trump supporter too.
Was he? Well, that
Yeah.
would make sense if there were these like lawsuits that he was trying. I don't know if he had already filed lawsuits or he was going to pursue lawsuits, but that caught my ear because there's been so many things going on recently with people who are like very outspoken against this administration. And I mean, just look at the January 6th people who, how many of them were held in jail for years without trial, like are still there.
Yeah.
And evidence is hidden. Anyone who questioned the election was censored. And a lot of them now being arrested, like Trump and the 19 individuals. And now they're going after like states, like different representatives with no just cause, no evidence, no nothing. It just it's pretty crazy. And it kind of reminds me of like what's happening even with people who aren't in politics, but like Andrew Tate, who was that conservative guy who was arrested for trafficking, yet the alleged victims say that he didn't do anything they're accusing him of, but they like won't listen to the victims.
Oh my God. It's like, okay, it is so weird that you bring up Andrew Tate because I am totally obsessed with this guy right now. I know this is a little off topic, but I've been listening to a bunch of his interviews on YouTube for the past week, and his whole take on like personal responsibility and self-belief and confidence and motivation and manhood. Like, I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to him before, except when I heard about the whole human trafficking scandal and arrest. And I at the time I was just like, oh, look at this douchebag, you know? But then I listened to his interview with Candace Owens that he did a few months ago, and it was awesome. And like it just came up on my YouTube feed, I think because of like the content that I follow. And I listened to the whole interview. It was like an hour and a half. I loved what he had to say. And so now I've been like binge listening to a bunch of his stuff. And he was not conservative before, and he has become conservative. And it was when he was becoming more conservative with his beliefs that he suddenly started being attacked for all of this stuff. And he has had his alleged victims actually come out publicly and state they were not victims. And like
Yeah.
there's video evidence of all of this.
It's like, so when I first heard about his whole arrest, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I liked that guy. Like, what a jerk and like what a horrible person. And I totally judged him. And then it wasn't until Tucker Carlson did the interview and we got to hear his side of the story. And this is why it's so important that we don't have censorship, because when you're only getting one side of the story, it doesn't matter if you liked the person before or not, you're going to form an opinion. And when I heard his side of the story, it was like, just like you said, these women were like, he was a friend of ours.
Yeah.
Like he never took our money or like paid us to do these things. Like everything they said was false. And so what this government is saying allegedly is that they can't listen to the victims because he has like control over them. He's brainwashed them. And I'm like, what? Like, what kind of universe are we living in? Like, it's like, this doesn't make any sense. And so that's when I realized, like, holy shit, this guy went conservative and they're like ruining his life, and not just his life, but his brother's life.
Yep.
And a lot of the people that they're associated with. And then look at Russell Brand. So another example, like Russell Brand gets accused of, sexual assault, or like, I don't even know what all he's accused of, but I know that it's by 4 women who are all anonymous. They refuse to like show themselves, their name, anything. And he's accused of things that were never reported to the police and that happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm sorry, but again, like I heard this and I thought like, oh man, like maybe he is a bad guy. And then I started hearing like, okay, they're all anonymous. It happened 20 years ago and was never reported. And it's like red flags right there. They're targeting him.
Yeah, because of his conservative content. Now that he's speaking out against vaccines, and he's gone from like being the crazy party guy to suddenly speaking out about issues that this government doesn't agree with. And I heard just today that like the BBC dropped him and his content was suspended on YouTube, so he can't monetize anything. And there's no actual evidence of anything yet, and it's all just allegations, but there's this immediate jump to like condemn the person before there's any actual evidence, and it's not right.
Yeah, I think it was Ben Shapiro that was talking about how like now you're guilty until proven innocent. It should be innocent until proven guilty, but he was talking about how they just suspended his YouTube, which was like $1 million a year that he was making from his YouTube videos. And they hear an allegation that hasn't, had a hearing. I don't even think any charges have been brought. Like no officials have like come to him on this. So again, it's like, how credible is this that no police are involved? There's no open investigation. There's no hearing. He hasn't been arrested, but they're going to demonetize him,
Right.
So it's like crazy that this is happening. Reminds me a lot of Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh. Like, remember, they were all calling him a rapist, yet there was no evidence, no police report, like that was ever filed. It was like decades ago. And it's just crazy. And like, quite frankly, Tara, like, this is why I was afraid to start this podcast in the beginning, because I see these crazy attacks on anyone who like goes off of the main narrative and disagrees with the left. Like they play dirty and they will try to ruin your entire life. And it's just like, I feel like that's like the whole point. They want people to see that if you veer from the narrative, we will take you down and ruin you.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is it gets people to self-censor. And so like the silent majority, right? It's like people are afraid to speak up. They don't want to speak up about any wrongdoing in our country. They don't want to get censored, that kind of thing. But I think in this case with censorship, good might actually prevail, because the New York Post just reported that a federal court of appeals just ruled that the White House, the Surgeon General, the CDC, and the FBI likely violated the First Amendment by exerting a pressure campaign on social media companies to censor COVID-19 skeptics, including the very famous Stanford epidemiologist, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And the article went on to say, quote, the September 8th ruling the September 8th ruling affirmed but narrowed a lower court order issued on July 4th by U.S. District Judge Terry Doughty, which found that the Biden administration and other federal agencies engaged in a years-long pressure campaign designed to ensure that the censorship aligned with the government's preferred viewpoints, and that the platforms, in capitulation to state-sponsored pressure, changed their moderation policies. So, based on all of that, like, I would say that good is finally prevailing. Like, I think most people are awake at this point to the blatant propaganda and censorship that's been going on. And they may have gotten away with it in 2020, but I don't think that they can keep this up for much longer.
Well, I think that all depends on whether there will ever be any accountability for any
Or
of
an
it.
election.
Or an election. Correct. Or an election.
Oh, we shall see. I'm just glad, like, at least someone, like, there's someone in our justice system saying, yeah, this is wrong, and knock it off. And so that's a start. And I'm going to choose to like be positive and say this is going to go far, and maybe to the Supreme Court. They think it might, and the Supreme Court will back it because it's mostly conservative. So we'll see.
Wait, I just realized we are ending Friday on what you think is a positive note.
Yay! The world's not ending. No doomsday. Let's go have a great weekend. The world is not falling apart, you guys. Everyone's waking up and justice is being served. That's what I'm going to tell myself.
Okay.
Until Monday, when like the world is ending again. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back here on Monday with more updates for you guys. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.